the webinar. My name is Marianne Bates, and I'm the Executive Director of JPAL North America. And I'm so thrilled that all of you have joined us today for the first in our webinar series. We're calling our webinar series Charting the Next Decade of Evidence Generation. And we're going to explore how we can build evaluations and generate evidence with state and local governments in some of the most critical policy areas. We're in the middle of a pandemic and related health and economic crises. We're in the middle of an ongoing climate crisis, and we're only starting to reckon with the important work that remains to be done in achieving racial equity and justice. And all of these ongoing events have exacerbated and highlighted the existing disparities across health, labor, housing, and education, and have disproportionately impacted low-income individuals and communities of color. And this is what motivates us to have this webinar series to do the work and what we're going to discuss today. Next slide, please. The JPAL North America State and Local Innovation Initiative supports state and local government leaders in the United States in using randomized evaluations to generate new and widely applicable lessons about which programs work, which works best, why, and for whom. And I'm so inspired by the state and local leaders who partner with us in this initiative. They're leading the movement for using evidence to improve lives. And every day they demonstrate that state and local governments can create and use rigorous evidence to address challenging social problems. Next slide, please. So we support our government partners as they identify the key questions they want to address with evidence, with a number of supports that you can see on the left of the screen here. And on the right, you can see the range of topic areas where we're working, where we're proactively launching new evaluations and working with partners on those. Next slide, please. And coming up, we have a number of webinars in this series. I just wanted to preview a few here at the start. And we look forward to having conversations with you as we prioritize evaluations on questions like climate change, racial equity, and responding to crises like COVID-19 pandemic. So we're really thrilled that you're joining us today. We're going to talk about how we can answer these questions with evaluations, how we form valuable partnerships across a wide range of disciplines and different kinds of organizations and government leaders. We're going to talk about how we can prioritize different questions for evaluation. And we're going to really talk about what meaningful engagement looks like across critical policy areas. So now I'm going to hand it over to my fellow co-chair of the State and Local Innovation Initiative, Bruce Sasterden, to kick off today's webinar.
Thanks very much, Marianne. Much appreciated. Yeah, so just to build a bit on what Marianne said, state and local is all about pairing up researchers and partnering with state and local policymakers and state and local governments to make important work happen and to provide the evidence that informs future policies to engage in poverty alleviation and promote growth and income and education and such. And it's very exciting stuff. We focus on randomized controlled trials, but it's not that our RCTs can be a terrific way to provide hard and credible evidence, but they're not just about providing a single number and subtracting, taking the mean for group A and the group B, and you get a single number, and that's the whole story. By running really rich RCTs, we can try to figure out what's going on underneath the hood and what's causing treatment effects and what things are working and what obstacles people are encountering in trying to meet their goals. And so that's really what that's really representative, and that really describes the kind of randomized controlled trials that JPAL has been funding and supporting and working with our partners on. And so today's session is all about combining different methods and working across disciplines to really understand the results and the meaning of the research that we do. And so this is going to be an exciting hour and a half for you, because we've got two of the best folks in that arena, and Stephanie DeLuca and Sarah Oppenheimer. And so you're going to hear not only about how they've worked with folks from different disciplines and been able to partner with a variety of state and local partners, but also you'll hear specifically about their Creating Moves to Opportunity study, which is just a fascinating story that went from idea and observational study to randomized controlled trials to then actually implementing, actually using some of the insights to change policy and continue to measure and continue to change things. So this is absolutely top-notch work, and I'm really thrilled to hear about it from the people who were right in the thick of it. Stephanie, we're going to start with Professor DeLuca. Stephanie DeLuca is a sociologist and professor at Johns Hopkins. She focuses on how social context affects the outcomes of disadvantaged youth. So she thinks a lot about how do youth make the educational choices they do, how do we get them to graduate from college, but then also she's got a very famous strand of research looking at the importance of where people live and how do we get people, if people are using housing vouchers, how do we get them to best use those and choose areas that will best benefit their family. And so, and I really enjoyed a paper of hers from several years ago looking at a Baltimore program, the Baltimore Housing Moving Program. And there, I think she really laid the foundations for the work she's going to talk about today. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Stephanie, and I think you'll really enjoy this.
Great. Thank you so much, Bruce. I want to make sure everybody can hear me, and I'm going to start sharing some screens. So if we can, just one chat can tell me that that's the case, then I'll know we're good. I know we have lots of folks on the video. Let me move to the slideshow here. All right, great. So it's a real honor to be here today. Thank you for the kind introduction, Bruce. I have to say, you know, it's wonderful to have a chance to say to my research team, you know, the kinds of work that we do can really matter. We can get a chance to share with people out in the real world, off campus, out of our ivory tower, as it were, and you know, and really take what we've learned from families, from in their living rooms and kitchens and backyards and stoops, and share it with you. And that helps me also make good on the promise that I make whenever I talk to families, landlords, real estate developers, teachers, and others. You know, that if they share their stories with me, I will share their stories widely. And I am grateful for their generosity and their vulnerability in letting us into their lives and sharing some of their, you know, enormous struggles, little victories, big victories, and I'm grateful to them. And so I've got a photograph here, a couple of photographs here at the beginning, just to make sure we don't forget that all of the knowledge and wisdom I'm going to share with you didn't come from me. You know, I wanted us to keep in mind who the real experts are. And so these are photographs of families in various studies over the years of my housing voucher studies and other neighborhood studies. And I wanted to just remind us again, who we're learning from. So I'm going to come at this question of how do we, you know, improve the design and the use of randomized trials by focusing on housing policy evaluations that I've studied over the past 20 years. So I'll start, I know that one of the exciting things about looking at the registrant list is that there are folks from all over different organizations across the country. I know we have some researchers with us, but also some, many, mostly practitioners. And I'm not going to assume, you know, the kind of in the weeds research knowledge that we have on the team here. So I'm going to share a bit of high level information with you all. And please feel free to queue up questions. If I miss anything important, that's key to be able to understand what we're doing here today. So I always like to think about the why we care questions whenever I'm doing research, presenting research, teaching. You know, why do we care about the particular study that we're doing? So I think that the why we care question that motivates a lot of the work that I've been doing with my team, you know, is the fact that we have now, you know, over 30 years of evidence that's converged on this compelling point, which is that it's not just the family that a child is born into, but the neighborhood she grows up in that shapes her fate. And so a lot of this research is interdisciplinary and mixed method and has really converged over time to this compelling point. And the exciting point here is that there's something we can do about this. We have, and that's what we're going to talk about today. We know enough now to act that American inequality is a spatial component. And that we can see this by growing residential segregation by income over time, persistent residential segregation by race. We have the unequal geography of opportunity. Children are not equally exposed to the kinds of beneficial social contexts we know really matter for them. And so the question is, how do we reduce spatial inequality, promote human potential, promote social mobility? We know enough to act, right? But how do we act? And this is where additional research involving interventions comes into play. So I've been spending a lot of time leveraging housing policies and interesting innovative programs to try to reduce spatial inequality. So if we know place matters, there are lots of different policy directions we could take to try to improve the kinds of environments young people grow up in. One of the ways we can do that is to provide low-income and minority families a chance to move to what we call higher opportunity neighborhoods, places that we know from research really do promote social mobility for children. And we have a program in place, the Housing Choice Voucher Program. I know some of you are running housing agencies, some of you with us here today. I'm eager to hear what you think of the work, and please communicate as well via email if there's something here that resonates or something you'd like to challenge. I'd be happy to hear from you. The Housing Choice Voucher Program exists. We've got roughly a $20 billion program that provides this almost a golden ticket lottery voucher that is not available to most families. Fewer than 1 out of 4 families who are eligible for a voucher get one. But even more, typically we know that Housing Choice Voucher participants live in moderate to high poverty neighborhoods, by and large, over 2/3. And so we have here research that tells us neighborhoods matter. We have an existing program that can do something about it, but typically it doesn't. How do we improve this program? Over the years, we've had innovative policies and programs that have used the Housing Choice Voucher as the basis of the intervention, coupled with varying levels of support and resources administratively and individually for families to help them move to safer, more diverse neighborhoods with better performing schools. And I've based about 20 years of my research studying what it's like to be a family in one of these programs, starting with my research in Chicago in the 90s, all the way through to some work we're doing in Seattle that I'll talk about. I've also spent time with families in cities where they, looking at what happens for families who don't have housing subsidies. How do families across income and race levels make decisions about where to live when they have, fewer or more constraints? So this is sort of all of the information that is at the basis of the presentation today. So one of the distinctive aspects of the work that I do is that I leave my office and take teams of students with me, and we go to where families are, and we spend time in their living rooms. Sometimes it's a McDonald's that's preferable, or a kitchen, a basement, a backyard, a park, and find out what it's like to be a participant in a program, find out what it's like to try to find housing without any subsidies. So a distinctive aspect of my work involves what we call in-depth narrative interviews. So, one question might be, why do we talk to people and not just use lots of aggregate census data, or maybe just have short surveys on the phone with, tens of thousands of people? Why do we talk to say only 100 people in one study, which is large for a qualitative study, but why would we do that instead of using just big data? So one of the important aspects of doing in-depth interviews, of doing them in people's homes, in their communities, spending time with them, often over multiple years, multiple visits, check-ins over time. Why do we do that? And I think that one of the most important things, and this is rarely mentioned in the method sections of research that uses qualitative methods, is that it allows families, what families say, to be expert knowledge from which we can craft better policies. Rather than explaining why, say, low-income parents make the decisions they do, they can teach us how. And this is empowering, right? And it tends to disrupt the cycle that happens when you have middle-class researchers interviewing, or middle-class white researchers interviewing low-income families, families of color, saying, trying to get them to explain their lives. Really, I mean, this is telling us instead, flips the script and puts families in a position to be the teachers and for us to be the students. And this is extremely empowering. Doing interviews, families have told us over the years that they know might help other families by sharing their story is enormously generative and empowering. Another reason we want to do this is because academics may be wonderful critics, but we're often terrible storytellers. And human beings are narrative by nature. So it's often effective to communicate findings directly from participants. And this is both through rigorous research methods, but also when talking to policymakers and practitioners and others who are not going to go through the trouble of reading the research papers, of being able to communicate in a way that tells stories and crafts a narrative that compels action. Also, we're not limited by researchers' imaginations and the sort of epiphanies that you might think can happen when you're sitting in your office and your computer. It turns out you can't get them all that way. You have to go out into the world and find out what's going on from the ground up. These sort of, we think of these as revelations that we sometimes learn, things we never thought we were going to learn, new questions we never thought to ask, answers we couldn't have imagined if we don't go and talk to families themselves. Doing in-depth interviews also helps us explore how families' lives, decisions, and strategies match up or fail to align with policy assumptions, which has happened more often than not when it comes to housing policy. In a sort of more humorous take on this, Sandy Jenks, a sociologist at Harvard, in describing my collaborator Kathy Eden's work years ago, was trying to explain the use of smaller N qualitative research and says it's really better to get interviews with people who are willing to trust you and tell you the truth than get a large random sample of the population who will lie to you. So another aspect of my work increasingly is that it's interdisciplinary. I would say I probably work now with more economists and sociologists, but it depends on the day. And I think that this is something that's a really key piece increasingly as I'm trying to understand how to improve policy. So one way to look at the place where economics starts and sociology ends and sociology begins is this quote I love from James Dusenberry, and who says, economics is all about how people make choices and sociology is about why they don't have any choices to make. And so there's a lot of truth in this quip. But I think why not use the tools and theories from both disciplines and anchor decision-making in social circumstances and resource constraints. It's typical that economists will focus a lot on incentives and decision-making and choice, whereas sociologists might look more at barriers. Both of these pieces are required if we're really going to move forward and understand how to do better policy. And if we want valuation research to be actionable and go to scale, we need to not only understand what works using the tools of RCTs and other quasi-experimental research designs, but how things work, how they don't, and for which families. So I'll give a quick example here of what we can learn from doing qualitative research across a number of studies I've done over the years, and sort of how we can upend the existing models in economics and geography and urban planning. So typically when we think about how people approach housing choices and how we're deciding where to live and send their kids to school, right, this sort of canonical model assumes that families get motivated to move to different homes in different neighborhoods because of changes in their families. Maybe they're having children, or their children are about to become school age, or they're having more children, they want a larger home. So parents are looking to buy homes. They search for what we think of as this forever home. Maybe if they have lots of resources, they can start with a beginner home. And then these models assume parents have time to pay close attention to school, neighborhood, and housing unit quality. And then families end up in the highest quality neighborhoods in housing units and school districts that they can afford. So this is sort of the canonical, often implicit model of housing choice and decision-making that undergirds research in a number of social science disciplines. However, we found that most of this is just wrong. And in fact, it's only right when we think about families with the most wealth and resources in the studies we've done. And typically, these are higher income white families. our research has shown us when we ask families how they end up living where they do and how they got to the next place, how did that happen, the process, we've learned that it's much more likely for low-income families that they didn't decide to move from one place to another, but were pushed out of the place they live in, something we call reactive mobility. Whether it was a housing quality fail, a housing policy change, like a demolition of a housing project, perhaps it was landlords selling out from under them, or neighborhood violence. These sort of reactive moves push families out of their homes, often in unpredictable at times. They don't see this coming, and they don't have a lot of time to try to get another place to live. And if they have a housing choice voucher, they don't have enough time to find a place to use their voucher. And so they're forced instead to use shortcuts and sure bet housing search tactics to find a place quickly, which often lands them in low-income neighborhoods, and in many cases, racially isolated neighborhoods as well. And given these time constraints, right, and the alternative, right, which is homelessness or losing your voucher, these alternatives are often unobservable when we don't interview families and have them tell us the whole story about how something happened. Given these time constraints, poor parents tend to search for temporary havens rather than forever homes, units that meet minimum standards for survival without thinking about investment, what kind of school district, whether I might want to buy a home in this neighborhood. And often that means that residential decisions are then decoupled. School decisions are decoupled from residential decisions. And then this starts a cycle where low-income parents end up in poorer neighborhoods, lower opportunity neighborhoods. And this repeats over and over again. This is much more in line with low and even moderate income parents that we've talked to in 5 different cities, right? So this kind of a model, right, versus the canonical, deliberate, sequential, planned model, right, is important because if we're thinking about how to support families' moves and how to best use housing choice vouchers, right, we need to understand that this is what the picture looks like. And years of experiences like this in housing markets can demoralize families and make them feel very pessimistic about their chances of leasing up at all, let alone in the kinds of neighborhoods that Bruce mentioned that are higher opportunity neighborhoods that might benefit their children. This is key to understanding some of what went into our evaluation of CMTO. So I'll give a couple of other examples here of specific instances of how qualitative research in particular helped inform quasi-experimental, but mostly experimental research projects with random assignment. So the first is, I think, one of the most important examples in our field in housing and housing policy. If not for 3 economists deciding to do interviews, which is unusual, Jeff Kling, Jeff Liebman, and Larry Katz, in the MTO, the formative period of the MTO, and the Moving to Opportunity Experiment study, if not for these interviews with families, the mental health assessment indicators might not have ended up in the long-term evaluation of Moving to Opportunity, which would then have left us unable to see that one of the biggest positive findings from MTO was a reduction in depression and stress, that leaving high crime, violent neighborhoods improved parents' mental health on par with best practices in antidepressant medication therapies. But this epiphany came up because families were interviewed at the beginning of MTO and talked about what a relief it was to leave neighborhoods where they were under siege and move to safer places. And if parents don't have an improvement in well-being, it's hard to imagine how better improvements in employment and other kinds of self-sufficiency outcomes are going to improve, including parenting. Another example is some work we've done on residential choice, as I was showing in the models before. We've done longitudinal qualitative work in a number of cities to try to understand the process of moving. And as I said, most families move. Most poor families move not because they decide one day to get up and find a better place to live and then begin the search and driving around and looking at different listings, but because they have to move and they're pushed out, literally because their house may be falling down around them, as happened in a number of homes I was in Mobile, Alabama during storms. So this upends, right, our common idea about choice models. It also helps explain why housing choice voucher families don't end up in higher opportunity neighborhoods and why some of the moves in the Moving to Opportunity experiment weren't durable. When housing quality failures would happen or landlords would sell out from underneath families in the MTO had moved to lower opportunity neighborhoods, they had to enter the private rental market again and were faced with some of the same challenges that they would have been that they faced before they had the MTO assistance. And a third example from my former student Anna Rhodes, who's at Rice University now, shed some pretty interesting light on why it is that in the work that Raj Chetty, Larry Katz, and Nathan Hendren have done on the MTO experiment, showing improvements, increases in earnings in college enrollment for children who are part of MTO, why those findings only held for children under the age of 13. Why is it that we didn't see improvements for, or potentially some negative impacts on teenagers? So we decided to talk to some families and also some children in the Baltimore Housing Mobility Program about what it was like to move. And we found out, and this will surprise no parents in the room, that friendships matter. And part of the challenge is that when younger children move, it's much easier to just pick up and start new friendships. They're less picky. It was good enough in Baltimore to just like the Ravens to make new friends when you moved from West Baltimore out to one of the better resourced school districts. But teenagers are more thoughtful and picky about who their friends might be. And it was harder to transition socially into some of these neighborhoods, which led fewer of the older children to move at all to some of these neighborhoods. The fourth example is what I'll talk about now, which is focusing more on policy mechanisms, which is the CMTO Seattle King County intervention, and why it was so successful in helping families move to high opportunity neighborhoods. So the CMTO program, as we call it for short, is a housing mobility intervention. As I mentioned earlier, it's the kind of innovative program that leverages housing choice vouchers, sort of adds on important resources, and including administrative flexibility and, and I'll talk about in a minute, some additional housing search assistance and landlord outreach. But what's so exciting about this project to me is that the research team didn't sort of, show up in Seattle and say, we'd like to do a study here. The Seattle and King County housing authorities came to us. So this is a ground up project that also leverages a lot of the past research I mentioned and the lessons of practice-based evidence from mobility programs like those in Baltimore and elsewhere to create a better intervention and then systematically test it with an RCT. And in this particular case, the treatment group received support, as I'll discuss in a minute, to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods. And a control group received a voucher in the standard services from each PHA. The full experiment had over 400 households, and the qualitative sample that I pulled was 160 households. But what we did, another hallmark of our work, is we did a stratified random sample for the qualitative work instead of using a convenient sample. And we looked across PHAs, across treatment arms, and at different points in the housing search process. So we stratified on these different dimensions to try to get a representative sample of the families that were in CMTO. And this is something that my team does. It borrows design elements from quantitative research that aren't typically used in qualitative research. And I can talk a bit about why we'd want to do that. But the most important reason is because you want to know who you got a chance to talk to and who you didn't, and how representative that is of the sample of people who participated in a program. So we use narrative interviews with families and family and staff, including ethnographic observations of the program, and coupled that with administrative data to be able to figure out why is it that the program worked. So there are a number of different elements here that we can talk about in more detail, especially during the Q&A, but three big buckets we know from previous research on housing and policy are really important here. One is search assistance that's customized to help families prepare for the rental market and interact with landlords, including being able to have referrals to units in neighborhoods that are high opportunity. A strong landlord engagement component to cultivate relationships with landlords, which is extremely important. Landlords are people too. And we've also had studies where we've spoken to them in many cities to find out what would it take to have a better relationship with the housing authority, and what would it take for landlords to be more likely to accept a housing choice voucher family. How do we make it easier for landlords to do that? And then finally, there's flexible, customized short-term financial assistance that families receive to help them move as well. So the short, we'll cut to the short and big findings for the CMTO study, which is that the treatment group, the share of families that moved to the treatment group, and the treatment group that moved to high opportunity areas was nearly 38 percentage points higher than the control group. And this is here on the graph shown against the historical mean rate of lease up in these kinds of neighborhoods across the housing authorities. So these are enormous impacts, the likes of which we typically don't see in social science interventions. This gives you a sense of where families moved across the metro area. The blue background shows opportunity neighborhoods. The red pins show where families in the control group ended up moving, and the green shows where families who received the CMTO assistance moved. So the families in the treatment group were offered these services if they were willing to lease up in an opportunity neighborhood. So that's how the program worked. So how did it work, right? So what kinds of elements of these interventions really mattered? This is a key question if we want to scale a policy up, if we want to make it cost effective, if we want to understand how to extend and expand. And so one thing that's really important is that when we do the narrative interviews, we're not just asking survey questions with an open-ended option. We're asking open questions that have as little direct, as little leading as possible. So what we said to families is, tell us about CMTO. Tell me what it was like, and let them take it from there. So the kinds of things that popped up unsolicited were really powerful. And then we would probe on more details about these mechanisms, but it's important that the initial set of questions is open with the prompt, tell me about that. And so when we looked at the intervention, the mechanisms that were likely to explain the intervention, like the first few candidates, which are those that might come to mind to economists first and maybe sociologists second, right, are better information about the kinds of neighborhoods that are going to promote children's futures, and financial incentives that you'll get, moving assistance, to be in some security deposit assistance to move. But we found that those two were insufficient to explain what ended up really making the difference for families in CMTO. Instead, what we found were a number of sort of social, psychological, and supportive, customized mechanisms, like the emotional support and communication of the housing, the family and housing navigator staff, as well as excitement about about moving to the kinds of neighborhoods that families had expressed wanting to move to most of their lives, but being unable to. In addition to streamlining the search process and making things easier, less taxing, and brokering with landlords, often an intimidating set of conversations, as well as customized financial assistance. I'm running out of time, but I wanted to share a few of these quotes directly so that we can sort of show you what it looks like when we get qualitative data and ask these open-ended questions. So one mom who moved to Issaquah, Jackie, who I interviewed, when I asked her to tell me about CMTO, what she said to me is a light bulb went on. It was this whole flood of relief, this whole feeling of, I don't know I'm gonna do this, right? How am I gonna move to this place? I don't know what I'm going to do. This isn't working. But then, it was the supportive nature of having conversations with the navigator that really made the difference, right? She wouldn't go on to say it felt like I was nourished. Melinda talked about meeting with the CMTO staff and said, the staff person made me cry when she explained to me what the program does. Like, it's not just we pay your rent, it's to make sure that you're not only in a good area, but your kid can grow up in a good area and be successful. And it made me happy to think my son is going to be in an area that can help him be a good part of society. Lisa, I think this quote really drives home the point about what we think of as bandwidth tax, right? The fact that lots of policies end up being, too taxing to take full benefit of. She says, I'm sitting on my phone. It's like me staring at my phone doing online housing searches, and he's playing around, my son, and I think the less I have to do that takes time away from him, and to find these units and find this housing, the better it is. Leah was talking about what it was like to have somebody support her conversations with landlords. And she talked about, finding a place and that the housing navigator will come with. She said, the navigator said, I'll come with you, we'll help you fill out the application, I'll talk to the landlord, I'll help you do a lot of complicated stuff, right? Again, so many of the families we talked to in Seattle and King County have been denied rental units because of credit histories or eviction histories. And so just that you know, the demoralizing experience of talking to a landlord, having that supported gave families confidence to be able to try to lease up in opportunity neighborhoods. The flexible short-term financial assistance was also helpful because it was customized to individual family needs. As Jennifer explained, you know, okay, so I'm not gonna be able to pay rent here and then pay it again in the new apartment. So when they were able to get me more money, that would help me, you know, pay more of that rent over there. They understood the situation that I was in, right? And that really makes a difference, as opposed to, you know, some moms that were telling us every time I go to an agency, it's just like paperwork and trying to figure out how much money I have. But this was a different experience. And finally, Nicole's story kind of put a lot of these pieces together, both the, you know, the housing search assistance, also the brokering with landlord, and some of the sort of customized approach. She talked about being denied. You know, some landlords, you know, will deny you because of your credit, like happened to me here, because I had the rental resume that the family navigator helped her put together. She was able to explain, right, as she said, the 4 derogatory marks on my credit, how they got there and how I'm getting them off, and I'm on a payment plan, and like what kind of parent I am, right? Writing a bit of an essay to be able to explain to landlords who you are made such a difference. And in Nicole's case, the landlord then said, well, you seem smart, you seem prepared. These things on your credit don't seem like such a big deal. And then the navigator said, okay, give her a chance and I'll give you a higher security deposit. So this is the combination of elements that made the difference. So I think in conclusion, you know, it's been my experience that if we want to create efficient, effective, and scalable policies to reduce inequality, we need evaluations with mixed methods, research designs, and interdisciplinary teams to do a few different things. One is to generate good hypotheses from the beginning with formative research, formative qualitative fieldwork, and other descriptive work. RCTs are expensive, and we want to be able to do the right ones. And so there's lots of ground level work that can inform that process. We want to identify not just whether something was successful and effective in improving family life, but how. These are the mechanisms that help us extend and scale policy. We want to examine policy assumptions and where they fail when they intersect with the everyday lives of the families we're trying to help, and figure out how do they respond to policies? What are we missing? You know, what kinds of strategies do they already have from, you know, a lifetime of struggling that might actually conflict with what the policy opportunity is? We also want to incorporate the perspectives of frontline staff at social service agencies and nonprofits, landlords and developers, who all you know, are part of this process. It's not just families that we have to focus on. We have to focus on housing providers as well and find out what it's like to say, you know, practice differently. It's possible to generate national bipartisan policy support and change the research. That's the good news. I'm going to let Sarah take it from here and tell you how we did that. It's possible. We can't do this without our funders. So I'm quite grateful to a number of funders, including the William T. Grant Foundation, the Spencer Foundation, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, the National Science Foundation, the Gates Foundation, the Sergo Foundation, and many others. And if you want to learn more about my work and my team, you can find us at my Poverty and Inequality Research Lab at otheramerica.org. Thank you so much. I look forward to hearing your questions and thoughts.
Well, thanks, Stephanie. That is completely fascinating. I have no doubt that's going to generate a lot of questions and comments from the audience. In fact, I was asked to give everybody a reminder. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat now and we'll stack those up, or you can wait until after Sarah has finished telling her part of this pretty fascinating story. This is kind of a cool lineup that JPAL has created, because Sarah also worked on this project with Stephanie, but has, you know, from a slightly different angle. She's currently the Associate Director of Policy and Research at Opportunity Insights, and she works on projects exactly like the one you just heard about. But prior to getting there, she was Director of Research and Evaluation at King County Housing Authority, and she worked on a variety of research projects and oversaw a number of program evaluation initiatives. So, you know, you're going to get this from, you're going to get a second perspective on a pretty cool area. So, and Sarah, if you could, I'd love to hear how you made that jump, and did you get recruited over to the Cambridge Mafia, or how did this all happen? And anyway, looking forward to hearing your end of the story.
Sure. Thank you so much, Bruce. I'm going to try to share my screen here. And maybe somebody can just tell me when they can see it. Okay. Hold on one second here, guys. Great. So I'm Sarah Oppenheimer. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Bruce. I'm so excited to be talking with you all this morning with so many great panelists, but also talking to such a group that represents such a diversity of perspectives. It's always so incredibly exciting to me when there are researchers from different disciplines around the table, as well as policymakers and practitioners. I think that's such a unique, increasingly less unique, but unique and rare opportunity to really move the needle on both science and policy and practice. So thank you so much for joining me. By way of introduction, yes, so I started working with Raj and Nathan and Stephanie back in the early days before CMTO was really conceptualized, and when we were all just sort of sitting around roundtables trying to think through what were the opportunities to pull together the research that was coming out at that time on the importance of neighborhoods, and really thinking about how much that meant from housing authorities' perspective in particular, since they're really charged in so many ways with building the strategy around how to build out geographic choice and access to opportunity areas among housing choice vectors. So it has been incredibly exciting to see the arc of this work. I did decide to sort of move over to Opportunity Insights after being at the Housing Authority for a number of years, which really sort of speaks to my career, which has always spanned policy and practice on the one hand and research on the other, and trying to really figure out where is that middle ground, where the research is asking questions that is policy relevant and really going to be helpful and accessible to the folks who are charged with implementing these programs and making these policy decisions. And at the same time, that perspective continues to enhance the science and that we continue to move that forward. So as Stephanie and I were talking, we thought that an exciting way to sort of end where CMTO has been going, and before we go to the panel discussion, is to talk about where this work is headed in light of the CMTO phase 1 results, what that has meant from a practice and a policy perspective. This is very much, I think, a rare moment in housing policy where we're seeing a lot of traction on how the CMTO pilot evidence is being used. There's still a long way to go, but I think it is a great example of really how the interdisciplinary nature of the work has enhanced its policy relevance. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes there, and then what I'm most excited to is to get to the question and answer and talk about things that are of utmost interest to you all. So in terms of implications for enhanced practice, what I always like to say is that CMTO was certainly not the first mobility program by any stretch of the imagination. As we built out the program, we tried to be very cognizant and learn from others who had gone before us. There are programs that have been long-standing programs in Baltimore, in Dallas, in Chicago, in other places. And then aside from those programs, there are now, I want to say, between 25 and 30 mobility programs across the country that are in various states of evolution, that are often run through public housing authorities or nonprofit partners. But in many ways, what CMTO did was really just try to document, unpack, explore, and study from multiple vantage points what was working, and do that much more sort of thoughtfully and carefully than perhaps had been done before. But there are a lot of similarities between what we did in Seattle and King County and what we've seen in other places. And so in that respect, we wanted to make sure that along the way, we were really making those learnings and those findings as public facing and as much of a public good to those 25 to 30 other communities, and also to other communities that perhaps hadn't been considering doing a mobility program. And so you can see here, this is the Opportunity Insights website. We're really, we, along with Jake Pell, MDRC, and the full academic team, have been so committed to really building out resources along the way that can be made accessible to practitioners. Really make sure that none of this information feels opaque. Oftentimes, the research feels very separated from what really will happen on the ground. And so I think a unique element that has really been enhanced by the qualitative evidence, which speaks to the mechanisms here, is to not just talk about what the findings are, and obviously the very rigorous methodology that came out of the RCT, but to also speak to what did the intervention look like? What did it look like, not just from a sort of academic sense, but what does it look like in operational terms that can be most relevant to housing authorities, state housing finance agencies, nonprofit agencies, those who are really thinking, well, if this works, then what does this mean in my own context? What can I pick and choose or borrow or learn from CMTO to put in place in my own community? And so we've put up intervention details from phase 1, which is what Stephanie talked about. We've put up intervention details from phase 2, which we can talk about in the Q&A, but basically is sort of the second phase, so to speak, of CMTO, where we're testing which specific elements of the intervention appear to be more or less impactful, and also creating spaces where we are sharing those findings all along the way with a variety of different audiences. So certainly wanting to make sure that those findings are shared on the academic circuit, but also making sure that we're bringing that information forward to housing industry groups, to state and local policymakers, and to others, both in terms of written resources here, but also in terms of webinars and other things. We just did a webinar last week with our colleagues at the housing authorities and our service provider, because what people are really clamoring for is to find out, what is the sort of context, what is the texture of these services, what do they really look like, and to hear directly from the service providers. And so we want to continue to create spaces like that. I think one of the most heartening things around sort of supporting a community of practice and enhancing the practice from this evidence has been when we are now seeing sort of practitioners speaking directly to other practitioners, and we don't have the evaluators playing an intermediary. And I think in part that is because the findings speak to the how that Stephanie was talking about. We're not just saying, hey, 53% of families move, but we actually have insights into mechanisms, insights directly from families that practitioners can build into their sort of small p policies. So then one of the other things that we're incredibly excited about, trying to advance my screen here, but it does not seem to be working, here we go, is that HUD is just as of now moving forward with their Housing Choice Voucher Mobility Demonstration. So this is a $50 million appropriation that came through 2019 and 2020 appropriations. HUD will be running a randomized controlled trial beginning in 2021 with 5 to 10 additional sites across the country to really understand what strategies are impactful for broadening geographic choice among housing choice voucher holders with young children. So we have been incredibly excited about this because the demonstration borrows very, very heavily from the pilot evidence that we generated in Seattle and King County. We've always been very cognizant of the fact that Seattle and King County is just one location, and in many ways it looks quite different from communities across the country. And so it's very important to have generalizable evidence that can speak to how these strategies work in a number of different communities across the country. This demonstration will give us that. It's a 6-year trial. It's obviously going to be in a number of different communities. There's an additional $3 million that will go towards evaluation, and we hope that that evaluation will remain interdisciplinary in the same way that CMTO was, so that we can not only understand, we broadly can understand what was effective, but also how it was effective for different families, for different landlords working across different housing markets, and what this meant from frontline staff perspectives. So that is something that we're looking closely at. I also think that there's a number of other evaluations of mobility programs afoot. MDRC is running a few, and that is all incredibly exciting, because I think the Seattle CMTO pilot sort of gave a preliminary pilot benchmark to then sort of spur this broader research. I think the more that we can broaden this evidence base, the more convincing and valid it will be from a policymaker's perspective. And then finally, at the sort of highest level sort of policy perspective, there is bipartisan legislation from Senators Van Hollen and Young right now called the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act that was proposed in 2019. This would make over 500,000 vouchers available for families with young children over a 5-year period. This is incredibly exciting since we have seen up to this point very few new vouchers come online despite the need that Stephanie was speaking to at the outset of the conversation. We know that that need is only growing further given the current financial or economic crisis. And so things like this are an amazing opportunity to not only make more housing resources available, but to make those resources available in a way that would also make services such as the customized assistance that we've learned about through the CMTO pilot also supporting those kind of services so that families really can use those vouchers in the communities that they choose. So we're hoping to see additional bipartisan support grow for things like the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act over the coming years, certainly to be further supported by evaluations such as that coming through the demo, and then continuing to just expand the practice-based learning. So I don't want to take up more time on that. I think that's just all to say, I think similar to the concluding remarks that Stephanie had at the end, I think certainly what we've learned about in the CMTO work is in some ways not just a model for how we can understand rigorous applied interdisciplinary evaluations for the particular housing policy context in which it was used, but also how that might perhaps be a model to apply to other policy issue areas. I think one thing that has been incredibly compelling about how the interdisciplinary perspective has been able to contribute to this policy trajectory is that it has really enhanced the narrative, as Stephanie was pointing out. I think that despite how large the results have been, if we didn't have these direct insights from staff and from families, this may not have felt as concrete as an impactful for policymakers to show the amount of traction and shifts that we've seen to date. So I have included my email as well as Opportunity Insights link there that has all of those resources, but certainly would love to continue to talk with folks more as they're thinking about either applied evaluations or these particular housing policy questions in your own community.
Thanks very much, Sarah. This is really neat. I mean, this is kind of, I mean, I've been viewing this from afar for good 15 years, and to see this kind of research start with some initial observational work, and then people were looking at it, people including Stephanie were looking at forced mobility, and then that led to some design of experiments, which then led to qualitative work, which led to better experiments, to more legislation, and to expand the program. So it's really exciting. And I have to say, I mean, certainly when I first got started in this business, it was rare that researchers would have such an impact on a direct impact on what policymakers were doing, and a positive impact, not just that they did what the research suggested, but that it really was backed up well with good ideas and good insights, and that it's been iterative, making it better as it goes along. So this is really an achievement. So as moderator, I got a full 20 minutes, but I definitely don't need that because we've already got some great questions in the chat. I'm going to just start with a couple kickoff questions, and then we can go right to the audience. One of the things I was wondering about was, did either of you feel like you needed specific training or had specific training on how to conduct these qualitative interviews? Because in my own work, and I tend to work on helping college students persist through college, we do a lot of talking with both staff that are talking, or the near peer mentors who are talking to the college students, and we talk to the college students, but like we just, to some degree, we shoot from the hip, or just, have a conversation. And so I'm wondering if there's any specific training or specific rules. Just one example, Stephanie mentioned this idea of like flipping the narrative to go from just tell me your story to like, tell me how to make the program better. So yeah, if you, maybe you want to talk a little bit about that. How from the hip is it versus sort of, a scientific method that you've been taught?
It's a great question. And I think, there's at least what our team has done, and this is work I've done collaboratively with Kathy Eden, Susan Clampett-Lundquist, a number of my grad students. I think by last count, 117 collaborators between the graduate students, the undergraduate students who also coded the data. So this is, also something I wanted to mention, which is that the work is not lone wolf work. This is collaborative work. And when you have a team of people who are going into the same communities, or sometimes doing longitudinal interviews, follow-ups with families who they've been in the same homes, are able to look at the transcripts that you looked at, and we're able to go, okay, I didn't see that thing that you started saying might be a preliminary idea. Okay, so there's this collaborative nature, but I think, the one key thing is the sampling I mentioned, which is difficult because I think of samples as things you kind of marry once you've decided to sample, and then you've got to get a lot of, you've got to get your sample. And we hold a really high standard of 80% in our response rates when we do qualitative interviews, which is a lot of shoe leather, a lot of recruitment, a lot of attempts, a lot trying to figure out, how to get people to tell you their story. So that's, there's sampling, there's the response rate. I think in terms of how we do it, so and we talk a bit more about this in our book, Coming of Age and the Other America. So we have structured research questions from which interview questions flow, typically about a 20-page interview guide that has these big, bold questions, right, where we start almost like an onion and say, okay, we always start with tell me the story of your life. It's an invitation to let us get to know who somebody is. And that says, hey, I'm going to sit here and I'm not going anywhere else. I want to learn you. I want to learn about you, to tell me, about who you are. And then we work our way into the question about, whether, it's a housing voucher or CMTO or something else, with these sort of open questions. Tell me about CMTO, and sort of let respondents lead, and then follow up with systematic probes that all respondents then get asked. Sometimes the probes aren't needed because it's come up in that open story. So this is just, there's a much longer way to talk about this, but it is semi-structured. But I think part of the way the interviews work, right, is that we ask all respondents all questions, but not in the same order, because, we want it to be a conversation that doesn't feel like a clinical study, and that means it's respondent-led. So it takes a lot of work to learn how to do this, and we don't hold paper when we do it. So we have the team memorize the interview guides, so that we can have eye contact and have these interviews. We have little cheat sheets. Sometimes we'll pause. We often pair these interviews, and somebody else is keeping track of what you didn't ask, who also might be helping, color in a coloring book with a child who's home, who might also be noticing it's getting close to dinner time. Should we leave soon? So it's a lot of work here. And then there's the analysis, which is the systematic coding that's done with typically with researchers who are not in these interviews, right, who are not attached to or exposed to some of our initial hypotheses. So there's a lot that goes into this that I think is not as common in qualitative research as it should be. But, I was trained as a quantitative researcher first, and so I held on to lots of things that came from that. But, I think from the hip, it's in some ways the last way I would describe what we do, but there's always an inductive, sort of unpredictable aspect of doing this work, which makes it really exciting. And so, so anyway, I'll stop there, but there's a lot that goes into this.
Thank you. That's super helpful. Sarah, I have a question for you, which is, I understand that prior to, coming up with the full design for CMTO, was there a number of learning circles with customers for King County Housing Authority? Like, how extensive was that, and did you end up using that to then change any details of the program?
Yeah, so we spent a full year. We at the Housing Authorities, the academic team, JPEL and DRC, others, really thinking about the design, and a component of that was spending time on the formative elements, formative research. So, speaking with current families who are participating in the voucher program, speaking with families who are currently on the wait list to receive a voucher, talking with landlords in the community, both those who were sort of longtime participants in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, but also those who maybe had not been as participatory. And then also, really talking to frontline staff who are the primary point of contact with families, and really sort of that face of the voucher program. We did that at really sort of intentional points along the intervention design process. to sort of check our assumptions as we were starting to kind of build out what was this intervention looking like. We would sort of build this out based on the learnings of what other programs were doing, based on conversations that we were having with folks on what seemed to be the barriers that you or that families are facing, and would sort of build this out and then go back and sort of check, okay, is this resonating with the groups that really are going to be using these interventions? I think that was really critical for making sure that we didn't end up making this very pristine, fantastic looking intervention that then when we made it available to families or pitched it to landlords, or when frontline staff were seeing it, they were like, well, what is this all about? This was cooked up in an ivory tower. This may be perfect, but it is so imperfect. Really, it's not going to work in our community. And so we made modifications in the design based on those conversations. We also then had a pilot period, and I think that oftentimes that is, there's not enough time for piloting in an RCT. I think that pilot period combined with the qualitative sort of perspective that Stephanie was bringing was invaluable, because I think we really learned how was this all going to look in action, and was this actually going to continue to resonate in the way we had intended. And then finally, one of the things we did is we carried over this idea of learning circles with the service providers who were actually providing these services. We had weekly learning circles with them to get a pulse check on how is this going, what are they learning, and then how do we need to think about potential modifications throughout the implementation period. Because even like despite all that formative work, despite the pilot period, we also knew that once we were really in the field, that there was a real possibility that we were going to be learning things from families about what needed to be modified. And so having those real-time feedback loops where I think everybody really felt like nobody was just being asked to do something and implement it, but really everyone was part of that learning responsibility was critical. And it helped to sort of establish what was the collaborative culture of this effort. And so that's something that continues on to this day. Yeah. Stephanie, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but.
I couldn't do it better, but I'll let Bruce move on to other questions, but I definitely I want to echo the collaborative sentiment in that the learning circles were then things that our research team would sometimes observe. And I think what was great was being able to have, from the ground up, be able to understand how an intervention gets built and how it's a living thing and how it evolves, but also then to be able to have, to talk to families and say, we're not with the housing authority, but we're trying to figure out how to help them improve this program. Tell us what works, what's missing, and then eventually, bring this back, which is, I think, really empowering, as empowering as it is illuminating.
Nice. Thank you both. I'm going to jump to some audience questions. And audience, apologies if I get it, if I get the question wrong or I butcher your name. And if you don't want me to include your name, maybe just throw that in the chat. But I'm going to take a chance here and start reading a few questions. So this is from Kristen Lalonde. She says that I work for a PHA, I'm guessing that's a public housing authority, that administers, as the chat moves, I lose the thread. Our conversations with community partners on these possibilities have raised many questions about the ways race, segregation, and inequity play into the discussion. There's concern about calling some neighborhoods better than others when that distinction nearly directly tracks with racial segregation. How can we acknowledge these concerns and contexts and move forward? I mean, that's a fantastic question, and so I'm going to let you both work on that one.
I can jump in here, and then Stephanie, we can tag team on this. I think that this is a critical question. I think it's one that we talked about a lot throughout the work in Seattle. I think one is that sort of central to the work that we did is this is not about restricting families' choice and saying these are the good neighborhoods, these are better neighborhoods. And I think what we've seen in a lot of the prior mobility work is that families didn't have that choice and they could only use their housing support in certain neighborhoods. I think what is really the central tenet of CMTO, and I hope this sort of broader policy strand moving forward is that this is about giving families real choice, right? To have more agency and to really have the supports that they need to make a decision about where they want to move. And that includes providing families with full information about what we know about different communities, and also making sure that the services that families are receiving are really able to be customized so that they are focused on families' unique needs. So I think one of the things that is really fantastic about how the services were provided is that each of the navigators who provided these services sat down with families and said, okay, what are you looking for in your next community, right? And so it matters if what, you know, is your child receiving an IEP? Is your mom babysitting? Is there public transportation back to your mom's house? Where's your church? You know, and so then I think they tried to say, okay, so then what communities have these various amenities? And real choice means that for some families, this means moving the needle and seeing a higher rate of opportunity moves. But if we had seen that 53% was 90 or 100%, I think we wouldn't have really met the goals of the program, because I think that that would have shown that families were moving and didn't feel choice. So I think that that is a piece of it, right? Is that this is expanding choice, not telling families where to move. The other component, I think, is, well, two more things, and then I will stop. But one is that this really needs to be a both and strategy. Stephanie alluded to this at the outset of her conversation. Like mobility is and geographic choice, and the voucher program is, I think, a critical tool that we have and need to do better with. But we also need to think about what does this mean for other communities that are not showing up as blue on that opportunity map, communities that have been disinvested in for a very long time, and what can we do to really bring the same level of interdisciplinary rigor and evidence to understand what do those strategies look like, and how do we sort of pilot and move forward on that stream of place-based research as well. And then the third is that I think one of the things I'm really optimistic about is that some of the work that Stephanie and her team are doing will help us to unpack how does race play into a lot of these families' experiences. I think this is an area that we don't have enough evidence on, and we really need to hear directly from families on. And so I think that that is one of the many places where I'm incredibly excited about the design of CMTO, because I feel optimistic it will give us a better sense of those unanswered questions.
Yeah, I mean, that's a nice point. It's through this qualitative work you can find out if the families feel like their choice was constricted, or how important it is to have a racial mix in the neighborhood they're moving to. And as you said, you were trying to customize the help to what the family was trying to achieve. That seems like a perfect example of why you want to do qualitative work, to figure out what's the objective of these families, and is this meeting, and like our assumptions about what the families want may be totally different than what they actually want. So agreed. Stephanie, there's a question for you from Kathleen Banks. Curious to hear your thoughts on longitudinal qualitative analysis. Is it possible to do so retrospectively across phases of the evaluation? Does it need to be part of the evaluation design?
Yeah, I think this is, it's challenging to line up, we'll figure out when is the right time to launch qualitative work, or even, survey data collection or anything. I mean, I think this is why, I was highlighting sort of some of the importance of formative work. Sarah mentioned this. I also think this is part of the work that, came out of MTO, right? That there's sort of generating ideas, kind of field work you want to do, right? And to be able to think at a high level about what makes sense moving forward. I think that we try to talk to families at different points in the, in the intervention. Some who were still searching, some who had just leased up, to find out and have that be fresh, and having happen, say, a couple days before we got there, right? Or a couple of weeks before we got there. I think this is, really a valuable piece. I think as we're moving into phase 2, obviously with the disruptions from COVID, we haven't been able to go back to Seattle, but we've been on the phone and we've been in Zoom conversations talking to families a bit about what it's like to be in this second phase of the intervention, and to understand a bit more about the importance of very specific aspects of the intervention. But I think it's, as I mentioned, I think the longitudinal work is challenging because, it's families are happy to talk, but phone numbers change. So, I think it's, there's lots to do here to sort of shore that work up. But I think, and also you mentioned this, Bruce, like there's this iterative nature of the work as well. So I think when people say, how do you do mixed methods work and how do you do interdisciplinary work? It's like, super hard, right? So, but I also think not everything you did is going to be in the journal article, right? Some of the formative work leads to the more developed questions. So longitudinal field work means a couple different things to me, from the formative work all the way to follow-up interviews with the same families over time. And that longitudinal work, the second kind, gives us a sense of how things unfold after the RCT. I think one of the questions in the chat I saw briefly, it was asking a little bit about that. What can we really learn? Life. In some ways, every RCT is an observational study after random assignment, right? So people may or may not move. They may or may not stay. It may or may not work out. How do those decisions get made? How do the assumptions, again, of the policy and the opportunity intersect with life as it unfolds? And I think some of the longitudinal work allows us to answer some of those questions as well, and design better survey questions and new kinds of questions, right, that we can then ask in a systematic way across a couple of cities. And so there's lots of different pieces here.
Thank you. Okay, so next one from Lucia Diaz-Martin says for either expert, has there been research on the impact of neighborhoods that people move out of as a result of access to the voucher program? I really like this question. I'm sure you've thought about it. What are the changes to low opportunity neighborhoods, that's in quotes, when people are enticed to leave them?
So I'll say a couple things, and then Sarah, certainly chime in. So a few different things. I mean, I think typically neighborhoods, we have to always remember too that, the voucher program only serves, right, fewer than 1 out of 4 families. So the total number of families who ever get a voucher, let alone a voucher with mobility assistance, is relatively small. I think some of our neighborhoods in Baltimore, sort of the highest housing voucher sort of concentrated neighborhoods, are no more than 5% of the residents in a tract. And so I think what low income, racially isolated neighborhoods, divested neighborhoods are far more prone to are other kinds of things that destabilize families, not mobility programs and voucher programs, but poor quality housing stock that hasn't been invested in, as well as, crime, labor markets that aren't hospitable to families' education levels. And, I think there are lots of other things, right? These are decisions that cities make and about where to invest in, capital development. Those things are, I'm much more concerned of population loss. I'm much more concerned about that at the neighborhood level being a cause for, instability than the voucher program. So I think that's it's something that's always important to keep in mind, that the residential instability we observed was rarely because families got vouchers, but much more likely to be caused by a number of other things that correlate with poverty and racial segregation.
Was there any evidence that once Seattle or Baltimore realizes that their area is being, people are being encouraged, small numbers of people have the vouchers, are being encouraged to move out of that area because it may afford less opportunity to children and the families? Do policymakers then say, okay, well, maybe if we fix this or change that? I mean, is there any evidence that sort of there's a policy response to the data that researchers are providing or that voucher programs are providing?
First, you mean in terms of really saying, well, if I'm looking at the map and I see that I'm a policymaker in not an opportunity area, what do I do here? I think the more sort of thinking about neighborhood impacts becomes embedded, I think that this does generate ongoing sort of policy conversations around, well, what do I need to be doing in my own community? I think that where the research, I think what often gets asked by those policymakers again and again is, okay, well, what's the secret sauce that has happened in these opportunity communities, and how do I emulate that in my own community? And that's where I think we need to continue to push on the research. But I think that it is broadly a positive thing in terms of sort of shifting the narrative and the policy understanding around how impactful communities and neighborhoods are on families' outcomes, and then really people focusing on that, jointly.
Another question from Sanjeev Kumar. Could you tell us what the features are of the families that ended up being the most successful or having the largest change in outcomes after moving? So in other words, kind of like heterogeneous treatment effects sort of thing.
Sorry, I can, we can both take this, but I'll just say, I mean, because we're actually, deep in this data right now. I think, so, and this is the case with the earlier MTO experiment as well. There are certain factors that predict lease up, in higher opportunity neighborhoods. So I think what we're seeing right now in the CMTO program, preliminarily we're starting to try to look at the bigger picture of residential choice. Is that, obviously it's harder for larger families to move. That's partly a supply side complication of finding, big enough units with, bedrooms. There are parents who are juggling several jobs and having some trouble being able to make it to some of the meetings. Some of those parents had also, quite a few children. So there are sort of some of these, very specific family circumstances that made it difficult. I think another interesting, sort of interesting subgroup difference that we noticed, and we're sort of exploring this now more in the data, is that some of the immigrant families in Seattle were, sort of really understood the pitch about opportunity neighborhoods, but wanted to stay in a community, and especially some East African respondents, wanted to stay somewhere where they had community ties. Some of their jobs were tied up in helping, others in their community directly, in addition to places to get food and wanting to have their children grow up with other neighbors who are like them. We heard some sentiments from our African-American respondents to the same effect. So I think that, there's, on the one hand, there's sort of families, the challenges that families bring with them that, leads to them wanting to sign up for housing assistance don't just disappear after an intervention, right? And this is a housing intervention, right? So it's, it's remarkable. We just have to remember when we recover, impacts, whether it's, mental health impacts or, later earnings impacts from a housing, only intervention, it's pretty remarkable. Of course, housing only, undersells how important housing really is. But anyway, I think, so some of those challenges that families bring with them don't just disappear, right, and continue to remain. And so, I know a number of folks are, talking about sort of policy complementarity, right? How do we sort of maybe have policies that work together? But I think there's so certainly challenges at the family level in terms of being able to lease up for families who wanted to. And then there are some families for whom they have a school locally that meets their child's special education needs, and they don't want to move because that particular school, especially in, I think, places where school choice is more common, that may be, something we want to consider. So there are lots of different ways to come at this and understand, again, the different the alternatives that families see to these different options that we don't see, say at the beginning of maybe designing an intervention, that it may seem like, a no-brainer to use a voucher or get financial incentive to move to a neighborhood. Research shows, can promote social mobility, but families have lots of strategies, wisdom, and micro knowledge that also has helped them survive before assistance showed up.
I think just two other things to add to that. I think that we intentionally wanted to sort of keep the criteria for participants coming into CMTO as minimal as possible. So there were not criteria around income levels or prior housing circumstances or anything like that, because we really wanted to see, were there heterogeneous treatment effects, right? Both upon move and also persistence in an apartment or in a community. And I think that although the magnitude of impacts varied a bit, we saw significant differences despite whether families, among families who had housing or identified as not having housing coming into the program, families at varying income levels coming into the program, and other sort of points of variation. I think that's important because I think there's a question around, well, were these services only effective for families that had a certain level of assets coming in or that kind of thing? Would landlords look differently at those families, that kind of thing? That's not what we're seeing, but we're also needing to obviously study longer term the persistence rates. We've seen that at 12 months, families are staying in these communities, and that's certainly heartening, but we need to understand more around sort of what the even longer term persistence is beyond a year, as well as to Stephanie's point, what are families' experiences upon move?
I've got a question here that I like, different tack here. You shared with us how people's stories help us learn the mechanisms for why a study work. How do you ensure, though, that you're not cherry picking which stories you highlight? how do you guard against your views as a researcher determining which stories to highlight and how?
Oh, this is such a good question. I like this question too. I think this goes to a few points. One is the, the collaborative nature of the work. I mean, I think, good science is really comes from being able to have people push and challenge your position. So we have research teams of, have multiple field workers on each site. And as we begin to develop research ideas from the findings, right, we share them with our team members and sort of push back against things that, don't make as much sense. And that leads us to a new round of coding. So a big piece of this too is how we code our data, and how we look across the, our sample for the prevalence of things that we think is important. For example, in our interviews, we kept hearing from families that the navigators provided support, right? This sort of strong sense that somebody's got your back, that somebody's there for you. And that's so different from their experience in maybe perhaps other agencies or other, to other kinds of assistance programs. And I thought, this is really impactful. I'm seeing this in this interview. I wonder if this, is a thing. And then you go to your data, and this is where we have students, usually they're my amazing Hopkins undergrads, code data systematically with software for segments where these things come up, and then look for prevalence of these sorts of things. And then we have reliability checks across multiple coders to be able to say, is this something that holds if somebody else looked at that data, to say, how prevalent is the mention of the importance of the navigator supporting families, right? And this was mentioned in over 60% of the interviews when asked, tell me about CMTO, or tell me what, one of the most helpful things about CMTO was. And so I think there are a number of levels, so cherry picking, right, is what, you would do if you had a non-systematic sample, or if you collected your data, analyzed your data, and wrote all your data all by yourself, perhaps. I just think, again, this is why collaboration and having folks who are not interviewers and not PIs analyzing this data and doing it, with this with inter-rater reliability to shore against some of that, and I think also, for example, some of the work we're doing now is looking at the question of, not just, why were families successful in moving, but also why, I mentioned earlier, some families didn't move. Or what kinds of things we're, working on, what things didn't work so well, and trying to get a range of different kinds of questions from the data, because it's a challenging question for lots of different reasons. But I think that's some of the, some of this, and also replicating across a couple different sites and having different collaborators come on and things like that.
Neat. Okay, so now here's a study question that your methods will probably help you answer. How easy or hard is it for families to adapt to a new area? Is there pushback from other families in the new neighborhood?
Well, Stephanie, do you want to jump into that, or do you want me to?
Why don't you take it, and then I'll pick up if there's time.
Yeah. So I think, two pieces on this. So one is that Stephanie and her team, Stephanie and her team have been asking families, how satisfied are you in your new community, and do you plan to move among that sample? And we see that families who have moved to these opportunity areas end up being much more sort of satisfied and indicating that they plan to stay in these new communities. So I think that is good preliminary evidence around how they're doing in that area, but we need to sort of more broadly contextualize that with the forthcoming interview information. I think in terms of pushback, sort of along the same lines as Stephanie was talking about around what does this mean for communities that families are moving out of, the number of families, because of the size of the study, because of the size of the voucher program, and because of the large number of opportunity areas across the Seattle-King County geography, we're not talking about an influx in a ton of, an influx of a ton of new families to just one or two areas. So I think that there has been, not a lot of pushback just because the magnitude is relatively small. I think that also, thinking of that map that Stephanie showed, we're seeing that families are choosing a lot of different communities across the opportunity designation. And so, that's one thing. I think that we also have seen that some, I mean, it varies, right? It's across the board in terms of there's still a fair amount of NIMBYism in some of these communities, and others, I think that we have seen an immense sort of welcoming spirit from schools, from, we had one principal at an elementary school who was thrilled to know that this program was happening and that her school was in one of these opportunity geographies, and what could she do to be supporting families. So I think it's sort of across the board, but, and I'm just looking at the question now to see if we've, but I think this question around the pushback around integration of suburbs at the national level, yes, I think the rollback of AFFH and sort of the broader policy context in which the demo is now happening is something to take to heart. And I also think that this speaks to the importance of testing this in other communities that have much different policy histories than Seattle and King County, that have much different demographics and are a much more sort of black-white demographic than we have in Seattle, where it is much more heterogeneous. Because I think that, we are having some conversations with partners in another community right now, and I am seeing some of the letters that have been written by folks in suburban communities, and it is striking. And so it is why we need to test this in other communities. Striking would be, I mean, a really generous, actually, description of that.
Neat. Sarah, while I've got you, one question in 1 minute. How did the King County Housing Authority determine this was a policy priority and get buy-in? Was that easy? Was it hard? Was it all you just being like, we're doing this? Like, how did it happen?
No. I think that their work on thinking about geographic impacts, predated me. It had been, really in place since 2011, 12, really trying to think about, I think have a critical eye towards, how did communities play into where they were acquiring properties, where they were developing, and also looking at the distribution of families within their portfolio, where were they living. I think that, and I think that speaks to how long some of these policy arcs need to happen before you see something like this, right? And so, King County had been having these conversations, as had the Seattle Housing Authority, for a very long time. I think then when the Opportunity Atlas and Larry, Raj, and Nathan's reassessment of MTO came out, I think that helped to just galvanize what was the evidence base on this even further. I think Seattle and King County also have always really tried to think about what is that intersection between their strategies and research, and work with researchers. And I think that they found a very sort of welcoming group in Raj and Stephanie and the rest of the academic team. But I think that sort of continual conversations around why mobility and how is that balanced out against place-based, and what does this strategy really mean for families, is something that continues to happen to this day, right? So this is sort of it's a long game approach.
Terrific. Well, this has been a fascinating hour and a half. It's been a great crash course in mixed methods, qualitative methods, and also at the same time housing mobility and vouchers programs. This has been really terrific. I'm glad we're recording this because I think I'm going to have a lot of my students watching this. Thank you both, Sarah and Stephanie. Wonderful job. I'm going to throw it over to Jess for 30 seconds if she wants to just tell us what's next in our seminar series. Cool. Well, looks like that's the answer.
Yes.
So, climate change. Oh, go ahead, Jess.
Hello. Yeah, thank you so much, Bruce. Thank you to Stephanie and Bruce and Sarah. That was so great. I learned so much from this webinar personally, so I hope everyone else did too. Thanks so much to our audience for joining our first webinar. So this is a series of webinars, and our next one will be next week on October 7th from 11:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. It will be a really exciting conversation on state and local policy responses to climate change. So if you're not registered for the series and want to be there, I just chatted the link that you can learn more and register. We also have this very fancy QR code. If you have your phone, and you can put your camera on it, and it'll bring up the registration form. So we're really excited about that. Hopefully you all can join us. I just wanted to quickly mention some ways to partner with JPAL that we have coming up. So we're putting out a call for letters of interest from state and local governments that will be opening in the spring of 2021. Through this opportunity, state and local governments can apply for technical support from JPAL, funding, and connections with JPAL's network of research to help develop one or more evaluations around some policy relevant questions. We'll also be putting out a request for proposals from JPAL affiliates and invited researchers who are partnered with state and local governments. And these selected researchers and their government partners will receive funding for pilot studies or full research projects through this request for proposals. Both of these are opening sometime in spring and closing sometime in summer. Exact dates will be announced later this year. So make sure you're subscribed to JPAL's newsletter and the State and Local Innovation Initiative mailing list to receive updates. On the slide, I just put some contact information for myself and Rohit, who's the State and Local Initiative Manager. If you have any questions or comments or just want to get in touch with us, please, I'll leave it up so you can jot it down or take a screenshot of it. But thanks so much for attending this. I hope that everyone thought the discussion was as informative as I did, and we hope to see you next week. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.